On May 2, 1945, Soviet soldiers stood inside a building that hadn't served its purpose in over a decade. The German parliament, the Reichstag, hadn't housed a single session of government since 1933, and yet more than 2,000 men had just killed or been killed to capture it. The smoke hasn't cleared yet. Soviet soldiers stumble through corridors so choked with dust and fumes they can barely see. Beneath their boots, spent cartridge casings, chunks of plaster, shattered glass and bodies. Hundreds of bodies, German and Soviet, tangled together in doorways and on staircases, evidence of fighting so close that some men died within arm's reach of each other. This is the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of the nation that launched the most destructive war in human history. And it's a ruin. It's been a ruin for years. Fire gutted it in 1933. No parliament has met here since. The windows were bricked up, the halls empty, the grand chambers silent, until this week, when over 1,000 German soldiers barricaded themselves inside and dared the Red Army to come and take it. The Red Army came, and the price was staggering. In the final days of the battle for Berlin, a city already being ground to dust by the largest military operation in European history, more than 2,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or wounded fighting for this one building. Not a fortress, not a military headquarters. A symbol, but symbols in the spring of 1945 were worth more than steel. What drove those men across a kill zone, up those steps and into room-by-room fighting against an enemy with nothing left to lose? And what did they find when it was finally over? In the basement, on the walls, among the dead. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the capture of the Reichstag became the defining image of Soviet victory, and why what was discovered inside its shattered walls tells a more haunting story than the battle itself. What the soldiers found in the basement and scrawled across the walls of that ruined building tells the real story of the war, and it's not what you'd expect. Let me set the stage. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most brutal final battles, hit that like button and subscribe. I cover the battles they don't teach you in school. Now, let me take you back to Berlin, April 1945, and show you how it all began. April 1945. The Third Reich was dying. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets had launched the biggest offensive of the war. 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft aimed directly at Berlin. Hitler was in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. The city was encircled, but this wasn't just a military operation. It was a political one. Stalin wanted Berlin. Specifically, he wanted it before the Americans or British could reach it. He set up a deliberate rivalry between his two most powerful commanders. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated general, would attack from the east with the First Belarusian Front. Marshal Ivan Konev would strike from the south with the First Ukrainian Front. Whoever reached the center of Berlin first would claim the glory. And the designated prize, the objective that mattered above all others, was the Reichstag. Not because it mattered militarily, because of what it represented. Stalin put it bluntly to his marshals. Who will take Berlin? Will it be we or the Allies? That line captures everything. The Reichstag was not a tactical objective. It was a trophy. But here's the thing. The Reichstag wasn't even a functioning building. It hadn't been for 12 years. Built in 1894, it was a massive neo-Renaissance parliament building with the inscription Dem Deutschen Volke, to the German people, carved over the entrance. But the building had an ironic history. The Nazis never liked it. When fire gutted it in the 1933 Reichstag fire, an event Hitler used as a pretext to seize emergency powers, they never bothered to rebuild it. For 12 years, it sat empty and damaged. By 1945, it was a ghost. Windows bricked up, interior gutted, surrounded by anti-tank ditches and barricades. The Nazis had turned the building they despised into a fortress. Zhukov knew the stakes. Stalin had deliberately pitted him against Konev, and failure was not an option. Further down the chain, General Vasily Shatilov, commander of the 150th Rifle Division, had a more immediate problem. He was under enormous political pressure to deliver the Reichstag by May 1st, May Day, the Soviet Union's most important holiday. That deadline would soon warp military reality in ways no one anticipated. So the stage was set, a burned-out shell of a building, defended by 1,000 desperate men, targeted by an empire that needed a victory photograph. But capturing the Reichstag would require crossing one of the most dangerous killing fields of the entire war, and the first obstacle was a bridge. The task of taking the Reichstag fell to the 79th Rifle Corps of the 3rd Shock Army, specifically the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions. Approximately 5,000 troops would be committed to the direct assault over the coming days. These weren't fresh troops. They had fought their way from the Oder River crossings, through the suburbs of Berlin, across canals and through fortified apartment blocks, suffering constant casualties. By the time they reached the Spree River opposite the Reichstag, many battalions were at half strength or less. Their equipment told the story of what they expected. PP Shea 41 submachine guns, ideal for the close-quarters urban fighting to come. Heavy machine guns, flamethrowers for clearing fortified rooms, and, crucially, heavy artillery that would be dragged forward to fire directly at the Reichstag's facade at near point-blank range. The Soviets also prepared something else, something that revealed the political nature of this entire operation. 9 red banners, numbered 1 through 9, victory banners, distributed to different divisions of the 3rd Shock Army. Multiple teams would compete to be the first to plant their flag on the roof. Banner number 5 was assigned to the 150th Rifle Division. It would become the most famous flag of the 20th century. Among the defenders were boys, Hitler Youth members, some barely old enough to shave, clutching Panzerfausts nearly as tall as they were. We'll come back to them. Inside and around the Reichstag, approximately 1,000 defenders held position, a chaotic mix that tells its own story about the state of the Third Reich in its final days. SS troops, Volkssturm militia, older men, some in their 60s, pressed into service, Hitler Youth, and bizarrely, Kriegsmarine sailors, German naval personnel who had been transferred inland because there were no ships left for them to crew. Think about that for a second. Sailors defending a parliament building in the middle of a landlocked city because the navy had ceased to exist. They were commanded remotely by SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke from the Führer bunker nearby. The building had been fortified with grim efficiency. Windows bricked up with loopholes for firing, rooms barricaded, the basement turned into a labyrinth of defensive positions. The garrison's primary weapon was the Panzerfaust, a single-shot disposable anti-tank weapon. In the open, it was designed to kill tanks. In corridors and doorways, fired into a room full of men, the blast was catastrophic. You didn't need to hit armor, you just needed a confined space. Between the Soviets and the Reichstag lay a series of death traps. First, the Spree River, crossable only via the Moltke Bridge, which was swept by fire from multiple positions, including the fortified Ministry of the Interior, a massive building the Soviets grimly nicknamed Himmler's house. Beyond the bridge, several blocks of fortified buildings that would need to be cleared one by one. And then the Königplatz, a vast open square directly in front of the Reichstag. No cover, no concealment, just flat ground, anti-tank ditches, and overlapping fields of fire from the building itself and surrounding positions. Any force attacking the Reichstag would have to cross this killing field in the open. 9 banners, 9 chances, and one deadline that was about to turn a military operation into a political farce. Among the Soviet officers preparing for the assault was Captain Stepan Neustroyev, 26 years old, commander of the 1st Battalion, 756th Rifle Regiment, 150th Division. He would lead the first organized push into the Reichstag. He was partially deaf from a concussion blast and walked with a pronounced limp from earlier wounds. He had survived the entire war to reach this doorstep. By April 28th, the Soviets were in position. The guns were aimed. The banners were ready. All that remained was the crossing, and the Moltke Bridge was waiting. On the morning of April 28th, units of the 79th Rifle Corps begin their assault across the Moltke Bridge. The bridge is partially damaged, but still passable. The problem is everything around it. From the Kroll Opera House to the west and Himmler's house to the east, German positions pour fire onto the bridge and the streets beyond. Soviet troops cross in short rushes, taking heavy casualties with every wave. Engineers work under fire to clear obstacles, dragging debris aside while machine gun rounds spark off the stone around them. The fighting for the buildings around the bridge, especially the Ministry of the Interior, is savage. Soviet troops clear it room by room, floor by floor. The constant crash of artillery isn't distant rumbling. It's immediate, concussive, the air itself punching you in the chest. Smoke so thick that visibility drops to meters. Soldiers navigate by touch along walls, and beneath the cordite and brick dust, the sickly sweet odor of decomposition from bodies buried under days of rubble. This takes the better part of 2 days. By April 29th, the Soviets hold the near bank of the Spree and the buildings flanking the approach to the Königplatz. The Reichstag is visible now, a dark, massive shape through the smoke, maybe 500 meters away. This is where the story takes a dark turn, not because of what the Germans did, but because of what the Soviets did to themselves. General Shatilov is desperate. May Day is coming. Stalin expects a victory to announce. The pressure cascades down the chain of command like a shockwave. Shatilov needs the Reichstag captured, or at least he needs to report it captured. On the evening of April 30th, before any Soviet soldier has set foot on the Reichstag's roof, Shatilov reports to his superiors that the banner has been raised. The report travels up the chain. Celebrations begin in Moscow. The problem is that it isn't true. The first attempts to reach the building have been beaten back. Soviet troops have reached the entrance in small groups but can't hold it. The Reichstag is not captured. The flag is not flying. And now a general has staked his career, possibly his life, on a lie. In Stalin's army, the consequences of failure went far beyond demotion. The only option now is to make the lie true as fast as possible, no matter the cost in lives. Around 1 in the afternoon on April 30th, after a massive bombardment, the first major assault begins. Soviet troops charge across the Königplatz under devastating fire. The open square is a wasteland of craters and flooded anti-tank ditches. Men fall in clusters. Small groups reach the front steps of the Reichstag, pressing against the massive columns for any scrap of cover. From the bricked-up windows above, machine gun fire rakes the entrance. The defenders hurl grenades down onto the steps. The first soldiers to breach the entrance find themselves in near-total darkness. The bricked-up windows admit no light. Smoke and dust fill every corridor, and from deeper inside the building, the defenders open fire with everything they have. Now consider what is happening less than a kilometer away at this very moment. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th, while Soviet soldiers are fighting their way through the ground floor of the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler puts a gun to his head in the bunker beneath the Chancellery. The man who started the war is dead. The garrison inside the Reichstag does not know. Mohnke's orders still hold them in place. They fight on for a building whose cause has already been extinguished by its own creator. But the Soviets haven't taken the building. They've barely taken the lobby. And the real battle, the one that would be fought in pitch darkness, room by room, floor by floor, is about to begin. What followed over the next 14 hours was not a battle for a building. It was a battle for every room, every staircase, every corridor, fought in darkness so complete that men fired at sounds. And the worst of it would happen in the basement. The Soviets bring up their heaviest guns. 152mm ML20 howitzers and 203mm B4 heavy howitzers are positioned at near point-blank range, some as close as 300 meters from the building. These are siege guns, designed to shatter concrete fortifications. The gunners can literally see their target. They fire over open sights, sending shell after shell into the Reichstag's facade. Each 203mm round weighs over 100 kilograms. The building shudders. Chunks of masonry the size of automobiles break free and crash to the ground, raising clouds of dust that swallow everything. Under cover of this barrage, and with every available Katyusha rocket launcher adding its screaming fury, Soviet infantry surges forward across the killing ground of the Königplatz. Picture this. The square is an apocalyptic wasteland. Craters filled with black water, rubble fields, smoke and dust so thick that men 5 meters apart cannot see each other. Soldiers run through it, firing blindly, screaming, stumbling over the dead from earlier assaults who lie where they fell, half buried in mud and shattered stone. In the first charge, some companies lost a third of their strength in minutes. Small groups reached the building's front steps, pressing themselves flat against anything solid. From inside, Panzerfaust blasts send shockwaves through the entryways, the concussion alone enough to kill in those enclosed spaces. Machine gun fire stitches across the columns, grenades bounce down the steps. But the sheer weight of numbers forces the issue. Wave after wave of Soviet soldiers push through the entrance. They are inside. But inside means they have entered a maze, and the defenders know every corridor, every stairwell, every blind corner. What followed was not a battle, but an excavation, room by room, floor by floor, body by body. Inside the Reichstag, the battle fragments into dozens of simultaneous micro-battles. The building is enormous, hundreds of rooms across multiple floors, plus the sprawling basement beneath. There is no front line. Soviet troops hold some rooms on the ground floor. German defenders hold rooms on the same floor 20 meters away. Fighting is vertical as well as horizontal. Germans fire down stairwells. Soviets throw grenades up them. The darkness is near total. The bricked-up windows turn every hallway into a tunnel of black smoke and muzzle flash. Neustroev, limping forward with his men, directs the clearance of the ground floor. The procedure is brutal and repetitive. Approach a door, kick it in or blow it open with a grenade. Spray the room with submachine gun fire. Check for survivors. Move on. Flamethrowers are brought in to clear rooms that cannot be taken any other way. The heat from the flamethrowers, combined with fires already started by the artillery barrage, turns sections of the building into an inferno. Men fight in rooms where the walls are literally burning around them, the paint bubbling, plaster cracking, and falling in flaming sheets. The air is so hot in some corridors that soldiers wrap cloth around their faces just to breathe. The corridors were dark, full of smoke, Neustroev later wrote. We fought room by room. You could hear German and Russian in the same hallway. That detail captures the intimacy of it, not a battle across a field, a battle across a doorway. The patchwork garrison fights with the ferocity of men who have nothing left. The SS troops in particular show no intention of surrendering. Panzerfaust blasts in confined corridors are devastating. The back blast alone can kill in an enclosed space. And in the narrow hallways of the Reichstag, every detonation sends shrapnel and pressure waves ricocheting off stone walls. Then the defenders do something unexpected. Rather than retreating out of the building, they retreat down into the basement. The Reichstag's underground level is a labyrinth in its own right. Utility tunnels, storage rooms, chambers that connect to other buildings. The garrison pulls back into this subterranean maze, taking their wounded with them. The result is a surreal vertical division. Soviets control the upper floors. Germans control the basement. Neither side can dislodge the other. The building is taken and not taken at the same time. Beneath the wider city, an even grimmer scene unfolds. On SS orders, engineers blow the bulkheads separating the Berlin U-Bahn subway tunnels from the Landwehr Canal. Water floods the tunnels. Thousands of civilians and wounded soldiers are sheltering down there. The exact death toll has never been established. The decision was made to deny the tunnels to the advancing Soviets. It drowned Germans instead. In the Reichstag basement, the darkness is total. Flashlights cast shaking beams through smoke so dense it moves like liquid. The smell of burnt powder, charred wood, and blood fills every breath. Men fire at muzzle flashes, at footsteps, at shadows that might be human. From this underworld, German defenders launch counterattacks up the staircases, temporarily recapturing rooms the Soviets have already cleared. The building changes hands, room by room, floor by floor, multiple times through the night of April 30th into May 1st. The Soviets cannot claim the building is taken while enemies fight beneath their feet. Every stairwell is a choke point. Every cleared room can become an ambush 20 minutes later. In 14 hours, the fate of a building that represented a nation was decided, and then undecided, and then decided again. While the room-by-room slaughter continues, there is one objective that matters above all others to Moscow: getting a red banner onto the roof of the Reichstag. This is the photograph, the proof, the propaganda image that will define Soviet victory. The flag Shatilov had already falsely reported, as raised, now has to actually fly. Multiple groups attempt to reach the roof on April 30th. Several are killed or driven back by fire on the upper staircases. Small red flags are hung from windows on the upper floors, provisional markers, but these aren't the banner. Banner number 5, the one assigned to the 150th Rifle Division, has to fly from the highest point. Late on the night of April 30th, likely around 10:40 in the evening, though the exact time is debated, Sergeants Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, accompanied by a small group led by Lieutenant Alexei Berest, fight their way to the roof. Yegorov is Russian, Kantaria is Georgian. The pairing is not accidental. It is a deliberate representation of the Soviet Union's multinational character, a propaganda detail embedded in the moment of triumph itself. The roof of the Reichstag is a skeletal ruin. The great dome has been destroyed for years. Steel beams jut into the night sky like broken ribs. Fires burn below, casting an orange glow upward through the gaps in the structure. Tracer rounds streak across the Berlin skyline from a dozen different directions. In every direction, the city is burning. Yegorov and Kantaria secure banner number 5 to a piece of the ruined framework. It catches the updraft from the fires below and unfurls against the dark sky. The flag rose over a city that was no longer a city, just geography on fire. But here is the complication that most people never learn. The famous photograph everyone knows, Yevgeny Kalday's iconic image of a Soviet soldier waving the flag over the shattered Berlin skyline, was staged. Kalday, a Soviet war photographer, arrived at the Reichstag on May 2nd, 2 days after the initial flag raising. He brought his own flag, sewn from tablecloths by his uncle, and restaged the moment for his camera. In some early versions of the photograph, one of the soldiers was wearing multiple wristwatches on his wrist, evidence of looting, which was later airbrushed out by Soviet censors. The most iconic photograph of Soviet victory in World War II is a staged recreation. The real moment happened in darkness, and no camera captured it. History pivoted on this single moment, and no camera was there to capture it. The most iconic photograph of Soviet victory was a lie that told the truth. Below the banner, the fighting continues. German troops in the basement hold out through May 1st. Small groups attempt breakouts. Others simply refuse to surrender. It is not until May 2nd, after General Helmuth Weidling, the commandant of Berlin, formally surrenders the entire garrison, that the last pockets of resistance in the Reichstag fall silent. On the morning of May the 2nd, 1945, the guns stop. Not all at once. The silence spreads unevenly across the city as word of the surrender reaches different units at different times. In the Reichstag, the transition is eerie. For days, the building has been filled with continuous noise, gunfire, explosions, the roar of flames. Now, stillness, dust settling, the creak of damaged structural beams shifting under their own weight, the drip of water from burst pipes somewhere deep in the walls. Silence, settling dust, the groan of stone. Soviet soldiers move cautiously through corridors they have fought over for 3 days, weapons still raised, nerves frayed past the breaking point. In rooms where combat raged hours earlier, they now find only stillness. German soldiers emerge from the basement with hands raised, gaunt, blackened with soot. Some wounded, being supported by comrades who can barely stand themselves. Others do not emerge. In the deepest parts of the basement, soldiers find men who chose their own end rather than face surrender. The building itself is barely standing. The facade is pockmarked with thousands of impacts. Interior walls have been blasted through so many times that some rooms have merged into one. Staircases are partially collapsed. Fires still smolder in sections of the upper floors. The grand hallways of what had once been a place of debate and democratic governance are ankle-deep in rubble, spent casings, and debris. And then comes the act that would endure longer than the battle itself. Soviet soldiers, with charcoal, chalk, pencils, crayon stubs, bayonet tips, anything that can make a mark, begin writing on the walls. After 3 days of deafening combat, the loudest sound in the Reichstag was a pencil on plaster, the scratch of chalk on stone, the quiet murmur of men reading each other's words. They wrote their names so no one could pretend they hadn't been there. And what they found as they explored deeper into the building, in its basement, on its walls, among its dead, would prove more haunting than the battle itself. When Soviet troops fully secured the building and began systematic clearance, they found hundreds of bodies throughout the structure, in the corridors, in the rooms, on the staircases crumpled where they had fallen. Some had died in hand-to-hand combat, bayonets still fixed to their rifles. In the basement, the scene was worse. A makeshift field hospital held wounded who had died untreated during the days of fighting, laid out in rows on the stone floor, with no medicine, no bandages, no water. German soldiers lay where they had fallen during the final holdout, some with self-inflicted wounds, their weapons still beside them. And among the dead, children, boys in oversized uniforms clutching weapons too heavy to aim. Hitler Youth members, some estimated at 14 or 15 years old, found still gripping Panzerfausts that weighed nearly as much as they did. They had been handed anti-tank weapons and told to defend the fatherland in a building the fatherland's own leaders had abandoned years earlier. Flashlight beams played over faces frozen in expressions that no soldier who saw them ever forgot. The basement smelled of smoke, blood, and damp stone. This is what the Third Reich spent its final currency on. Not strategy, not survival. The lives of children. In the hours and days after the fighting ended, Soviet soldiers covered the interior walls of the Reichstag with inscriptions. Thousands of them. They wrote in pencil, chalk, charcoal, crayon, and carved letters into stone with bayonets and knives. The messages ranged from simple stamps to declarations that compressed the entire war into a few words. Names, ranks, and hometowns. Soldiers recording that they had been here, that they had survived to reach this place. Unit designations, marking territory the way humans have marked territory since the beginning. Declarations that carried the weight of 4 years of war. We came here so that they never come to us again, and the one that stops you in your tracks when you see it on the wall. Stalingrad to Berlin. 4 years and 2,000 kilometers in 3 words and an arrow. There were messages to the dead, inscriptions honoring comrades who hadn't lived to see this day, their names scratched into the enemy's parliament by the friends who carried their memory this far. Messages to the future. Remember what this cost. The graffiti was multilingual, Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, Kazakh, Uzbek, reflecting the multinational reality of the Soviet army. These were not just Russian soldiers. They came from every republic of the Soviet Union, from the Caucasus to Central Asia to the Baltic states, and they wrote in their own languages on the walls of the building that had symbolized the power that tried to destroy them all. Yelena Rezvskaya, a 25-year-old Soviet military interpreter attached to the Third Shock Army, walked through the Reichstag in those first days. She later wrote of what she saw. Everywhere, papers, broken glass, overturned furniture, and on the walls, already the first scrawls of the victors. Rezvskaya would go on to carry an even more surreal artifact of the war's end, Hitler's jawbone, recovered from the Chancellery bunker for forensic identification, transported in a red satin-lined jewelry box. But that day, in the Reichstag, she watched young soldiers write their names on the walls of the enemy's parliament and understood what she was witnessing. Not vandalism, testimony. Today, members of the German Bundestag debate legislation beneath walls, still covered in the handwriting of the soldiers who conquered this building 80 years ago. When the Reichstag was restored in 1999 by architect Norman Foster, the decision was made to preserve the Soviet inscriptions. They remain visible. Thousands of messages from 1945 embedded in the walls of the modern German parliament, read by lawmakers every single day. Beyond the bodies and the graffiti, the Soviets found the detritus of a collapsing regime scattered throughout the building. Documents from government ministries, personal effects of the defenders, photographs and letters that would never be sent, hundreds of spent and unfired Panzerfausts, ammunition crates pried open and emptied, ration tins, and in the basement, among the dead and wounded, they found civilians, ordinary Berliners who had taken shelter in the building during the battle, caught between two armies in a structure that became a furnace, with nowhere to run and no side to surrender to. The cost of taking one building, an estimated 2,000 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded in the direct assault on the Reichstag between April 28th and May 2nd. The broader Battle of Berlin was even more staggering. Approximately 80,000 Soviet soldiers killed and over 275,000 wounded. German military dead in the battle exceeded 100,000, and the civilians, the people of Berlin caught in the crossfire, are estimated between 20,000 and 50,000 dead, though the true number may never be known. The banner Yegorov and Kantaria had raised flew over a charnel house. The building that hadn't housed a parliament in 12 years had become a mass grave. 2,000 souls spent for a symbol. Soviet war correspondents and photographers flooded the Reichstag within hours of the surrender. Calde staged his famous photograph on May 2nd, creating the image that would be transmitted worldwide, the Soviet Union's equivalent of the Iwo Jima flag raising, an instant icon. But unlike Iwo Jima, the world's most recognized image of this victory was a reconstruction, arranged by a photographer who arrived after the fact, with a flag sewn from tablecloths. The real moment belonged to darkness and smoke and two exhausted sergeants on a ruined rooftop, and history kept no picture of it. But the battle's end was just the beginning of the Reichstag's strange afterlife, and the building's story didn't end in 1945. The Reichstag sat in ruins for decades. Located in West Berlin but directly on the border with East Berlin, it became a Cold War relic. The Berlin Wall would later run just meters from its eastern side. Too symbolic to demolish, too damaged to use. Too politically sensitive to restore, it stood as a hollow monument to a century of German catastrophe, visited by tourists who peered through fences at a building that belonged to no functioning state. It wasn't until German reunification in 1990 that the Reichstag was given a new purpose. Norman Foster's renovation, completed in 1999, transformed it into the seat of the Bundestag, the parliament of a reunified Germany. Foster's design made a radical and controversial choice: preserve the Soviet graffiti. The inscriptions were cleaned, stabilized, and protected, but left visible. Some sit behind glass, others are simply there on the walls, where anyone walking through the building can stop and read what a 20-year-old soldier from Stalingrad scratched into the plaster in May of 1945. A building that carries its scars openly. The decision was not universally welcomed. Some Germans saw the graffiti as a reminder of occupation, of the Soviet Army's darker legacy in Berlin, of humiliation. Others saw it as an essential act of historical honesty, a parliament that confronts its own past every time a lawmaker walks to the chamber. Both views contain truth. The battle itself was immediately mythologized by Soviet propaganda. Kalday's staged photograph became the defining image. The story was simplified for public consumption. Heroic Soviet soldiers stormed the citadel of fascism and planted the red flag. The messy reality, the false reports, the political pressure, the children among the defenders, the days of room-to-room fighting in total darkness, was smoothed over and filed away. Shatilov's premature report was quietly buried in classified archives. The multiple competing flag-raising attempts were consolidated into a single heroic narrative. Even the identities of the flag-raisers were shaped by politics. Yegorov and Kantaria were confirmed as the official heroes, at least partly because a Russian and a Georgian pairing served Stalin's narrative of multinational Soviet unity perfectly. The age of the Third Reich ended in a building the Nazis never even liked. We started with a paradox. More than 2,000 men killed or wounded to capture a building that hadn't served its purpose in 12 years. A parliament building where no parliament sat. A symbol with no function, but walk through the Reichstag today and you can still read their words. The graffiti is still there. Stalingrad to Berlin. Names of soldiers from Kiev, Tbilisi, Moscow, Almaty. The scratched testimony of men who crossed a continent of war and needed the world to know they had reached the end. The building's function in 1945 wasn't political. It was human. It was the place where the war finally ended, and the men who ended it wrote their names on its walls so that no one could ever pretend it hadn't happened. The Reichstag was never really about Parliament. In the end, it was a wall, and the soldiers who took it turned it into the most unlikely guest book in history. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more battles like this one waiting